Thora hadn't expected her first day aboard the human vessel to begin with screaming. As the youngest xenobiologist ever appointed to the Centaurian Science Division, she had prepared extensively for this diplomatic mission. She had studied human physiology, memorized their customs, and even practiced their peculiar facial expressions. But nothing in her research had prepared her for the reality of human biology. The incident occurred during what should have been a routine medical examination. Commander Marcus Reed, the human liaison officer, had volunteered to be the first subject of their joint biological study program. Everything was proceeding according to protocol until Thora's scanning device detected unusual movement in his lower abdomen. "Commander Reed," she chirped, her crystalline antennae twitching with concern, "there appears to be autonomous movement in your ventral region. Are you harboring a parasitic entity?" Reed, who had been lying quite comfortably on the examination table, raised an eyebrow. "Parasitic entity? No, I don't think so. Everything feels normal to me." Thora's iridescent scales shifted from their usual calm blue to an alarmed purple as she adjusted her scanner. "But the readings indicate independent muscular activity. It's moving on its own." The commander's confused expression slowly transformed into understanding, followed by barely contained amusement. "Ah, Dr. Thora, I believe you're detecting normal human male physiology. It's a natural function, nothing to be concerned about." But Thora was already backing away from the examination table, her antennae fully extended in a threat response position. "Natural. Commander, I studied human anatomy extensively. There was nothing in the medical texts about autonomous movement in your digestive region." Reed sat up, carefully arranging the medical gown to maintain his dignity. "Some aspects of human biology are, less formally documented in diplomatic exchanges. Perhaps we should schedule a detailed discussion about human reproductive systems." At that moment, Dr. Prell, Thora's Centaurian supervisor, burst into the medical bay, attracted by her earlier distress signals. "What's the emergency? Are we under attack?" The human. Thora gestured frantically with her upper appendages. "He has an uncontrolled biological reaction occurring. We need to initiate quarantine protocols." Dr. Prell's scales shifted through several colors before settling on an embarrassed orange. "Ah, young one, I see you've encountered one of the more dynamic aspects of human physiology. Commander Reed, my sincere apologies. We may have overlooked certain details in our junior xenobiologist's preparation." Reed couldn't contain his laughter any longer. "No offense taken, Doctor. Though perhaps we should update those diplomatic medical texts to be more comprehensive." As understanding slowly dawned on Thora, her scales flushed a mortified pink. She had just caused a diplomatic incident over basic human biology, her first day on the job, and she had managed to turn a routine examination into an interspecies embarrassment. I apologize, Commander," she managed to stammer. "My reaction was unprofessional." Reed's warm smile surprised her. "Actually, Dr. Thora, your reaction was perfectly natural. And if it helps, you're not the first xenobiologist to be startled by human biological functions. There was this incident with the Andromedans last year." As Reed shared more stories of cross-species misunderstandings, Thora felt her embarrassment gradually fade. Her scanner continued to pick up the unusual readings, but now they seemed less alarming and more intriguing. Here was an aspect of human biology that defied her expectations, suggesting there was much more to learn about their new allies. "Commander," she ventured, her scientific curiosity overcoming her earlier panic, "would you be willing to participate in a more detailed study? There's clearly a gap in our understanding of human physiology that needs to be addressed." Reed's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I would be honored, Doctor. Though perhaps we should establish some clearer protocols first, to avoid any more dramatic reactions." Dr. Prell made a sound that might have been a cough or a laugh. "Yes, I believe a full review of our xenobiology training materials is in order." And Thora, the young scientist, looked up nervously. Sometimes the most significant scientific discoveries begin with unexpected observations, even if they do involve autonomous movement. As Thora began updating her research notes, she reflected that perhaps this embarrassing incident would lead to something positive after all. If nothing else, future Centaurian xenobiologists would be better prepared for the surprises of human biology. And she had to admit, her first day had certainly been memorable. Later that evening, as she reviewed her scanner data, Thora realized that this mishap might actually advance their understanding of human-Centaurian relations. After all, true diplomatic progress often came from acknowledging and embracing their differences, not just their similarities. She began drafting a new protocol for biological studies, carefully noting the importance of comprehensive briefings on all aspects of physiology, even those that might seem obvious to one species or another. As she worked, her scales had settled into a determined shade of green. She would turn this embarrassing moment into a breakthrough in interspecies understanding, even if it meant facing a few more awkward conversations along the way. The research vessel's mess hall buzzed with an unusual energy as Thora entered, her scales shifting through nervous patterns of blue and green. 2 weeks had passed since the infamous examination incident, and while the initial embarrassment had faded, she now found herself the center of unexpected attention. Her detailed report on human physiological responses had somehow become required reading among the Centaurian crew. Commander Reed sat at what had become their usual table, already halfway through his morning coffee. He'd developed a habit of meeting with her to discuss cultural differences, though Thora suspected he equally enjoyed watching her reactions to human behavior. Today, he was accompanied by Lieutenant Naomi Winters, the ship's chief engineer, whose presence made Thora's antennae twitch with curiosity. "Your scales are particularly vibrant this morning," Reed observed as Thora settled into her seat. "Something on your mind?" "The biological compatibility study results came in," Thora replied, her scales flickering with excitement. "It appears humans and Centaurians share some fascinating cellular responses to environmental stress." "Lieutenant Winters, actually, your engineering expertise might be valuable for our next phase of research." Naomi looked up from her datapad, interest sparking in her dark eyes. "Oh, how so?" Before Thora could explain, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red emergency lights pulsed as Captain Chen's voice echoed through the communication system. "Medical emergency in engineering. All qualified personnel report immediately." They rushed to engineering, finding chaos upon arrival. A coolant leak had created a toxic cloud, and 2 crew members, one human and one Centaurian, lay unconscious near a sealed compartment. The ship's environmental systems were struggling to clear the air. "The containment field is failing," Naomi reported, fingers flying over a control panel. "We need to get them out, but our environmental suits won't fit the Centaurian anatomy." Thora's scientific mind raced through possibilities. "Commander, remember those cellular compatibility readings? Centaurian scales can filter certain toxins. If I can get close enough." "Absolutely not," Reed interrupted. "It's too dangerous. We don't know the concentration levels. But my research indicates human lung capacity and Centaurian toxin filtering could work together. If we coordinate our efforts." Thora's scales pulsed with determination. Reed studied her for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "Explain exactly what you need me to do." What followed was a dangerous but carefully coordinated rescue. Thora's scales filtered the worst of the toxins while Reed's superior human strength allowed them to move the unconscious crew members to safety. Their different biological advantages complemented each other perfectly, though not without cost. In the medical bay afterward, Thora watched with fascination as the ship's doctor treated Reed for minor chemical burns. "Your skin's healing response is remarkable," she observed, scanner humming. "The rate of cellular regeneration when combined with our medical compounds." "Still taking readings." Reed chuckled, then winced. "Even after nearly getting poisoned." "Science doesn't stop for emergencies," Thora replied primly, though her scales flushed a pleased pink. "Besides, this incident has provided invaluable data on human-Centaurian biological cooperation." "Is that what we're calling it?" Naomi had joined them, carrying diagnostic reports. Because from engineering's perspective, it looked more like two people being recklessly brave together. Bravery is just another biological response, Thora insisted, but her antennae betrayed her embarrassment. Though I'd admit, working with Commander Reed has challenged many of my preconceptions about human physiology and behavior. Still surprised by our autonomous movements, Reed teased, earning himself a color shift to deep purple from Thora's scales. That incident has been properly documented and filed, she said with all the dignity she could muster. Though it did lead to some interesting observations about human humor and its role in stress relief. Their banter was interrupted by Dr. Prell, who entered with an unusually serious expression. The preliminary report from engineering suggests the coolant leak wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately tampered with the containment systems. The mood in the medical bay shifted instantly. Reed sat straighter, ignoring his injuries. Sabotage. Any ideas who or why? There are elements within both our species who oppose this collaboration, Dr. Prell said carefully. Our biological research, particularly the recent breakthroughs in human-Centaurian cellular compatibility, has drawn unwanted attention. Thora's scales darkened with concern. The compatibility studies are purely scientific. They pose no threat to either species. Unless, Naomi suggested slowly, someone is afraid of what else we might discover about each other. Reed's expression hardened. Then we'll have to work even closer together. Thora, how would you feel about expanding our research? Not just biological compatibility, but full integration of our species' strengths. Thora's antennae quivered with excitement despite the tense situation. That would require extensive testing, detailed protocols, careful documentation of all physiological responses, including the autonomous ones. Reed couldn't resist adding, earning himself another color shift from Thora. Including all relevant biological functions, she replied diplomatically, though her scales rippled with amusement. Though perhaps we should focus first on preventing any more sabotage attempts. As they began planning increased security measures and accelerated research protocols, Thora realized how far they'd come from her initial shock at human biology. Now she was helping forge new grounds in interspecies cooperation, proving that their differences could be their greatest strength. Even if some of those differences still made her scales change color at unexpected moments. The research vessel's laboratory had become a fortress of sorts. After the sabotage attempt in engineering, security protocols had been heightened throughout the ship. But Thora and Commander Reed had transformed their workspace into something more. A symbol of human-Centaurian cooperation, where biological differences were celebrated rather than feared. Thora adjusted her scanner settings while Reed reviewed the latest security footage. Their casual banter had evolved into a comfortable routine, punctuated by his occasional jokes about autonomous movement and her color-shifting responses. Another encrypted transmission was intercepted. Reed reported, his usual humor absent. Someone's been sending our research data to an unknown location. Thora's scales rippled with concern. The cellular compatibility studies. Those are classified under both human and Centaurian protocols. Not just those. Reed pulled up a holographic display. Everything. Including your initial, anatomical observations. That report was sealed. Thora's antennae stood rigid with embarrassment. Who would want? The lab doors hissed open as Lieutenant Winters rushed in, her dark hair disheveled. We've got trouble. Big trouble. Someone's trying to access the main biological database. Reed was instantly alert. Location. Server room. But that's not the worst part. Naomi's expression was grim. They're using both human and Centaurian access codes. This is an inside job. Thora's scientific mind raced through implications. The database contains everything. Cellular structures, physiological responses, potential medical applications. In the wrong hands. It could be used to develop biological weapons targeting either species. Reed finished. We need to stop them. Now. They hurried through the ship's corridors, Thora's scales shifting between alert red and tactical blue. She'd come to appreciate how humans like Reed moved in crisis situations, all focused energy and controlled power. Her own species' response was more measured, their color-changing scales providing natural camouflage. The server room door was locked, but Naomi made quick work of the security panel. Inside, they found Dr. Prell interfacing with the main computer, accompanied by a human technician Thora didn't recognize. "Step away from the console," Reed commanded, his voice carrying that unique human quality of threatened violence held in check. Dr. Prell's scales showed no surprise, only a deep purple of resolve. "You don't understand. The research must be stopped. We're getting too close." "Close to what?" Thora demanded, her own scales darkening with betrayal. "To the truth." The human technician spoke with an accent Thora couldn't place. "That our species are more compatible than anyone ever imagined. Do you realize what your little accident report started?" Thora felt her antennae twitch with confusion. It was just an observation of human physiological responses. It was the first honest documentation of our differences. Dr. Prell snapped. No diplomatic filtering, no political correctness, just pure biological reality. And it led to discoveries that certain parties want buried. Reed moved with that startling human speed, positioning himself between the conspirators and the exit. What discoveries? The cellular compatibility isn't just surface level. Dr. Prell explained, his scales showing conflict. Preliminary tests suggest our species could potentially share genetic material, create hybrid biological systems. Some believe such knowledge could lead to the end of both our pure species, or the beginning of something new, Thora countered, her scientific enthusiasm breaking through her caution. Think of the medical applications, the potential for enhanced resistance to environmental hazards, like surviving toxic coolant leaks together, Naomi suggested with a knowing smile. The human technician made a break for the door, but Reed's superior strength easily contained him. Dr. Prell's scales shifted to resignation as ship security arrived to take them into custody. Later, in the now-secured lab, Thora and Reed reviewed the damage. "They didn't manage to transmit the full database," she reported, antennae twitching with relief. "Though my original anatomical surprise report is now circulating on both our species' networks." Reed's laugh filled the lab. "Well, look at it this way. You've become famous for advancing interspecies understanding, even if it started with a misunderstanding about human male biology." Speaking of understanding, Thora's scales shifted to a curious green. Dr. Prell mentioned genetic compatibility. "Would you be willing to participate in some additional studies? Purely for scientific purposes, of course. More detailed anatomical observations." Reed teased, causing her scales to flush pink. "I thought you'd never ask." As they began setting up new testing protocols, Thora reflected on how far they'd come. What had started with her embarrassing overreaction to human physiology had evolved into groundbreaking research that could change both their species. Even if some still feared such change, she and Reed were proving that their differences could lead to spectacular discoveries. "Just promise me one thing," Reed said as they worked. "If you discover any more surprising aspects of human biology, try not to set off the ship's alarms this time." Thora's scales rippled with laughter, displaying a new pattern she'd developed just for him. One that combined the colors of both their species in a harmonious blend. "No promises, Commander. After all, the best scientific discoveries often begin with a shock." The quarantine lab hummed with anticipation as Thora prepared for the most ambitious experiment of her career. Through the reinforced observation window, she could see Commander Reed already positioned in the testing chamber, his calm demeanor betraying no hint of nervousness. The same couldn't be said for her scales, which flickered through a rainbow of emotions as she calibrated the sensitive equipment. "Vital signs stable," Lieutenant Winters reported from her station, dark eyes fixed on the monitoring systems. "Though I'm still not entirely convinced this is a good idea. All breakthrough science carries risk," Thora replied, her antennae twitching with barely contained excitement. Besides, after the sabotage attempt, we need to understand the full extent of human-Centaurian biological compatibility. The implications for both our species could be revolutionary or catastrophic, Naomi finished, depending on who you ask. The lab doors slid open as the ship's new security chief, Lieutenant Commander Rajesh Patel, entered with his team. After Dr. Prell's betrayal, security protocols had been dramatically enhanced, especially around sensitive research areas. Perimeter secured, Patel reported crisply. Though I must formally register my concern about this procedure, attempting to merge human and Centaurian biological systems, even temporarily, has already happened naturally, Thora interrupted, her scales pulsing with scientific conviction. The coolant leak incident proved our species can work in biological harmony. This is simply a controlled study of that phenomenon. Inside the chamber, Reed's voice came through the comm system, tinged with his characteristic humor. If you're all done debating the wisdom of this experiment, I'm starting to feel a bit like one of those ancient Earth lab rats. Thora's scales flushed pink at his teasing tone, a reaction she'd long since given up trying to control around him. Initiating preliminary scan sequence, she announced, focusing on her instruments. Commander, please describe any unusual sensations, besides the usual autonomous movements you find so fascinating, Reed quipped, causing several technicians to poorly suppress their laughter. Commander, Thora managed, her scales now a mortified purple, please attempt to maintain professional decorum during this historic scientific procedure. Of course, Doctor, Reed replied, though she could hear the smile in his voice. Proceeding with professional description of all biological responses, autonomous or otherwise. The first phase of the experiment involved exposing Reed to a carefully controlled dose of Centaurian biochemical compounds. Thora's research suggested that human cellular structure could potentially adapt to and incorporate certain aspects of Centaurian biology, particularly their ability to process toxins and change skin coloration. Experiencing a slight tingling sensation, Reed reported as the chamber filled with a fine, iridescent mist, similar to when we were exposed to the coolant leak, but more systematic. Thora's scanner showed fascinating results. Human cellular structure is responding exactly as hypothesized. Commander, your skin should begin showing signs of chromatophore development. Now, a collective gasp filled the lab as patches of Reed's exposed skin began to shimmer with subtle color changes, not unlike Centaurian scales. Well, he remarked, examining his arm with interest, this is certainly new. Though I have to say, Thora, you wear it better. Remarkable. Thora breathed, her own scales shifting through patterns of academic excitement. The human body's adaptability is extraordinary. Your cellular structure is not only accepting but actively integrating the Centaurian biological elements. Integration at 30% and climbing, Naomi reported, though her tone carried a note of concern. But his core temperature is rising. Thora's antennae twitched with worry. Commander, are you experiencing any discomfort? Nothing I can't handle, Reed assured her, though his voice sounded strained. Though I'm beginning to understand why your species finds human body heat so remarkable. The experiment continued, with Reed's body showing increasing signs of Centaurian biological adaptation. His skin now displayed complex color patterns, and preliminary readings suggested he was developing limited toxin filtering capabilities. But as the integration percentage climbed, so did the complications. Temperature reaching critical levels, Naomi warned. We need to abort. Wait, Reed gritted out. We're so close to full integration. Just a few more minutes. Thora's scales rippled with conflict. The scientist in her wanted to push forward, to see the full potential of this breakthrough. But something else, something more personal, couldn't bear to see Reed in pain. Initiating emergency purge, she commanded, overriding the protests of several researchers. Clear the chamber immediately. The next few moments were chaos as medical teams rushed in to stabilize Reed. Thora found herself at his side, her scales radiating patterns of concern she'd never displayed before. "That was reckless," she scolded, helping him sit up. "Your human stubbornness could have caused permanent damage," says the scientist who screamed about autonomous movement during our first meeting. Reed managed a weak smile, his skin still showing faint traces of Centaurian coloration. "Besides, the results were worth it. Look." He held up his arm, where a small patch of skin continued to shift colors in response to his emotions, a permanent marker of the experiment's partial success. Thora's scanner confirmed that a small percentage of Centaurian cellular structure had been permanently incorporated into his biology. "Fascinating," she murmured, both professionally and personally intrigued by this development. "Though this isn't quite what I expected when I set out to study human anatomy." "Life's funny that way," Reed replied, his newly color-changing skin displaying a pattern that matched her own emotional state. "Sometimes the most significant discoveries come from unexpected places." As the medical team insisted on transferring Reed to sickbay for observation, Thora found herself reflecting on their journey. What had begun with her embarrassing overreaction to human physiology had led to groundbreaking discoveries about the potential for their species to quite literally find common ground. "Doctor," Naomi called from her station, "you need to see these readings. The cellular integration, even at partial levels, it's showing signs of being transferable." "Transferable?" Thora's antennae stood rigid with shock. "You mean any children Commander Reed might have would likely inherit these Centaurian traits?" Naomi confirmed, her expression meaningful. "Assuming, of course, the other parent was compatible." Thora's scales shifted through every color in her emotional repertoire as she processed the implications. Their research hadn't just proven that humans and Centaurians could share biological traits. It had opened the door to something much more profound, a future where their species might truly become one. In sickbay, Reed was already planning the next phase of experiments, his partially color-changing skin displaying patterns that Thora found increasingly easy to read. "You know," he mused, "for someone who was initially terrified by human biology, you've certainly become an expert in the subject." "Perhaps," Thora replied, her scales showing a complex pattern of professional satisfaction and personal affection. "It was less about overcoming fear and more about learning to appreciate the beauty in our differences." As they began discussing modifications for future experiments, both knew they were on the verge of something revolutionary. Their accidental journey from anatomical misunderstanding to biological breakthrough was about to change everything. For their science, their species, and perhaps most importantly, for them. The grand conference hall of the Interstellar Science Academy buzzed with anticipation. Representatives from both human and Centaurian worlds filled the amphitheater, their murmured conversations creating a symphony of different languages and vocal patterns. At the center of it all, Thora stood beside Commander Reed, her scales shifting between professional confidence and nervous excitement as they prepared to present their groundbreaking research. Reed's partially color-changing skin, a permanent reminder of their experimental success, displayed patterns that matched her own emotional state. 3 months had passed since the integration experiment, and their discovery had sparked a revolution in interspecies relations. "Ready?" Reed whispered, his hand briefly touching hers in a gesture that sent ripples of color across both their skins. "As ready as I'll be," Thora replied, her antennae twitching with anticipation. "Though I still think we should omit the initial anatomical misunderstanding from the presentation." "Are you kidding?" "It's the best part," Reed grinned. "Nothing captures the essence of our research better than your journey from screaming about autonomous movement to pioneering human-Centaurian integration." Lieutenant Winters, seated in the front row with Lieutenant Commander Patel, gave them an encouraging thumbs up. Their ship's crew had become their strongest supporters, even as controversy swirled around their discoveries. The hall fell silent as the Academy's director stepped forward to introduce them. "Today's presentation represents more than scientific achievement," she announced. "It represents hope. Hope that our differences need not divide us, but can instead lead to extraordinary evolution. As Thora began their presentation, her scales displaying perfectly controlled professional patterns, she couldn't help but marvel at how far it had come. The initial scans from her embarrassing first examination now served as baseline data, showing how little they've understood about each other's biology. The breakthrough came not from trying to overcome our differences, she explained, bringing up holographic displays of cellular structures, but from learning to embrace them. Human adaptability combined with Centaurian biological flexibility created something entirely new. Reed stepped forward, deliberately allowing his color-changing skin to display more dramatic patterns. The partial integration wasn't just successful, it was inheritable. We discovered that human Centaurian offspring would naturally possess traits from both species, creating a true biological bridge between our peoples. The announcement caused excited murmurs throughout the hall. Thora's scales rippled with satisfaction as she continued, but perhaps more significant than the physical changes were the psychological ones. The ability to display emotions through color changes has led to unprecedented levels of empathy and understanding between our species. Though some of us are still working on controlling exactly what emotions we display, Reed added with a meaningful glance at Thora, causing her scales to flush pink despite her best efforts. The presentation continued with detailed scientific data, but it was the personal implications that captured everyone's attention. The possibility of true biological harmony between species opened doors that many had thought forever closed. During the question and answer session, a young Centaurian scientist raised her hand. Dr. Thora, given the success of partial integration, have you considered attempting full biological merger? Thora's scales shifted through thoughtful patterns. We've developed protocols for such experiments, yes. In fact, she glanced at Reed, who nodded encouragingly. We're preparing to attempt the first complete human-Centaurian biological integration next month. The announcement caused a sensation. Complete integration would mean creating a being who was truly both human and Centaurian, possessing all the strengths of both species. The implications were staggering. And who will be the test subject? Someone called out. Reed stepped forward, his partial color-changing skin displaying patterns of determination. I will. After all, I'm already halfway there. After the presentation, as congratulations poured in from colleagues and dignitaries, Thora and Reed found a quiet moment alone in one of the Academy's crystal gardens. The three moons of the Centaurian homeworld cast shifting lights across their color-changing skins. So, Reed said softly, ready to completely redesign human anatomy. Thora's scales rippled with amusement. After that first examination, I think I've earned the right to make a few adjustments to your biology. Just promise you won't scream this time, he teased, drawing her closer. Though I have to admit, your reaction to autonomous movement did lead us down an interesting path. The path to understanding. Thora mused, her scales displaying the complex pattern she'd developed just for him, a swirling mixture of professional admiration and personal affection. Though I never imagined my first major scientific discovery would start with such an embarrassing misunderstanding. Sometimes the best discoveries come from seeing things differently, Reed replied, his color-changing skin synchronized perfectly with her patterns, even if those things happened to be basic human anatomy. As they stood together in the garden, their partially merged biologies creating beautiful patterns of color in the moonlight, Thora reflected on their journey. From her initial shock at human physiology to pioneering the future of interspecies relations, every step had taught them more about each other and themselves. The full integration procedure will be dangerous, she said suddenly, her scales showing concern. There's still so much we don't understand about complete biological merger. Then we'll discover it together, Reed assured her, his patterns shifting to display confidence and trust. After all, isn't that what we've been doing since that first examination? Thora's antennae twitched with affection as she recognized the truth in his words. Their story had begun with fear and misunderstanding, but it had evolved into something revolutionary. Proof that the greatest discoveries often come from embracing the very differences that once seemed insurmountable. As the three moons rose higher, casting their combined light over the crystal garden, Thora and Reed continued planning their next great adventure. Their bodies might be changing, evolving into something entirely new, but the core of their connection remained the same, a perfect blend of scientific curiosity and personal understanding, sparked by one very memorable anatomical misunderstanding.